No, I'm not gonna file for bankruptcy, just lower the workers' wages. Welcome back, you guys! We're so close to being done with my midwinter cleaning, I can smell it. Or at least, I no longer smell the Sonic curry coming from my cabinet. Those things expire quicker than Sonic. God, I can't believe you got it done so quickly. It only feels like the third day of me doing this. Alright, here's the plan. We clean that last part of the house and then we're done. No more cleaning. That should hold me off for at least another week. Alright, here we go. Come at me, Phil. I don't even know what that is. Here we have the Atari 5200, a successor in almost every way to the Atari 2600, but somehow also a failure in almost every way. Now, the average viewer might be saying, well, other consoles were coming at this time. Sega, Nintendo, of course the Atari 5200 is going to do badly. It's being overshadowed. But the new console takeover had just barely started. The NES came out only a year before the Atari 5200, and the Sega Mark III was just barely coming out. So at this time, Atari had every position to be at the top of the market. This was also still at a time where other console developers were stepping in the ring and creating their own different consoles. The Video Pack, the PV-1000, the Super Cassette Vision, the BBC Bridge Companion, the Dyna, the Family Computer Disk System, all these other consoles came out and saw success. But we don't know the names of these consoles, and the Atari 5200 is probably the start of when we started seeing a relevant console start to fade into irrelevancy. The Atari 2600 made history, and the Intellivision was seeing great numbers. But after that, we started seeing these new consoles, these indie consoles, these big up-and-coming consoles start to fade away from the history of video games. Not many people know many of the consoles I was talking about just now. But even when you push away history and aging and the other big console companies that would come over to dominate the industry, the Atari 5200 was still a failure. So let's look at a time where these homey consoles were starting to see the beginning of their end. The Atari 5200 Super System, or the Atari 5200 as most people know it, was released in 1982 as a direct successor to the Atari VCS, which was later renamed as the Atari 2600. The console actually debuted the 360-degree controller, allowing the player to put in inputs not restricted to 8 different directions like the Atari 2600. While this was groundbreaking and actually had a large effect on current controllers, this did come with a few problems. The console was sometimes inconsistent with inputs, and a lot of missed inputs would be put in. This would become a large thing against the console. Being a second generation console, the Atari 5200 had pretty advanced technology compared to its predecessor. Compared to the other consoles such as the Commodore PET and the Apple II, this console had amazing technology. However, the Commodore and Apple had higher product margins, so that means that there was obviously something wrong with this console. At the end of its lifespan, this technology was later repackaged into the Atari 400 and 800. Now for the biggest key to this console's unsuccess, the games. The games were small plastic cartridges that would go on top of the controller. But the console's game library was significantly lacking. The most notable games I can think of are Frogger, James Bond 007, the Atari version of Mario Bros, Pac-Man and Miss Pac-Man, Q*bert, Space Invaders, and a couple other retro games that you can probably think of off the top of your head. Now the thing is, you might be saying to yourself, well, those are some pretty good retro games. Those are notable games, and those have a large place in history. The issue is that very few of those games were actually exclusive. The only exclusive games were Pac-Man, Junior Pac-Man, Frogger, Q*bert, and Missile Command. Those games were the most notable Atari 5200 exclusive games, and even then a few of those were ported over from the Atari 2600. That meant that there were only 70 games on the Atari 5200 during its lifespan. Now I'll give it to them, that was a pretty good number for the time. However, considering the amount of exclusive, notable games there, it just simply wasn't enough to justify the console being a completely separate console other than those games just releasing on the Atari 2600. Another issue was that Atari 2600 games could not be played on the Atari 5200, meaning that games like Pac-Man and Space Invaders, it took a while for them to be actually ported onto the Atari 5200, and even then those ports were kinda degraded in one way or another. This meant that there was no 1 or 2 real games that pulled people into buying an Atari 5200. If anything, that just made the Atari 2600 sell more because those consoles had the exact same notable games. Another key element of the console's unsuccessfulness, which wasn't as significant as the game library, was the marketing. The console was marketed as a console in disguise, which begs the question, why not just buy a computer instead? There's more games there. What's weird is that the Atari computer did exist. Atari made computers, can you believe it? The Atari computers were actually pretty decent. They used a 10 kilobyte operating system, which was nothing shabby for the time. But the Atari 5200 used a 2 kilobyte operating system. And half of that was used for the built-in character set, which is barely used anywhere. Why? So much of this console is just unnecessary. It's unnecessary that you can't use Atari 2600 games on the Atari 5200 and have to wait for them to be ported in slightly better rehashes. The controller is unnecessarily stupid, and the design of the console is just unnecessarily bland. If you look at the console and compare it to other consoles that are already out by Atari, nothing stands out about it. Nothing screams, oh look at this is a new Atari console. And even then you can't even tell that it's a game console. The only distinguishing feature it has is a console with the 3 controller ports in the front. Otherwise, it just looks like I can put toast in there. Also, don't let the image fool you. This console is clunky. It looks pretty slim, but it's actually 13 by 15 inches in length and width. That's pretty big for a console. So in short, why did this console fail? Well, there was no reason to buy it. It blended in with so many other Atari consoles, the 2600, the 5200, the 400, the 800, and even the computer. At that point, the only console worth buying because it was the most different and had the highest quality of games was the 2600. Also, the controller sucked, which meant that there was really no convenience in using it. The game library was lacking, meaning that you can get a better library on even other console developers. So let me paint you this picture, right? You're a consumer walking down the aisle waiting to buy a new video game console. On that aisle, you see the Atari 2600, which has some of the most notable games of all time. You see the Nintendo Game & Watch, which has some really cool features. The NES was not out at this time, by the way. You see the Coleco Mini Arcade, which had a huge library of games. You had the Intellivision, which used a bunch of new hardware from across the board. And then you see the Atari 5200. Less games, worse hardware, clunkier controller. What do you buy? You buy a Sega Genesis, that's what you buy. In case it wasn't immediately obvious, this console did not sell well at all. Throughout all 3 years of its life, it was outnumbered by a bunch of other consoles, including the NES, the Game & Watch, even the other Atari consoles themselves were outselling this console. So really by this time, this console had no place. This was about the time that we wanted to see consoles advancing forward, and it felt like Atari was stuck in the past where it could get away with anything and get sales. The console was discontinued 2 years after the original launch of the console, and almost 40 years later now we get to see what kind of legacy it left behind. Above all else, most people remember the console as having a really bad controller, and that's kind of what sticks out to most people when they think of the console itself. When it comes to the actual deep down reasons, it's because of not what it had, but what it didn't have. Good games, accessible hardware. It just didn't have anything that set it apart, and that's what made it a failed console. A lot of other consoles at this time were facing this same issue, not because it was as bad as the Atari 5200, more so other consoles were coming out and they were just getting outweighed by those consoles. But that's what really stuck out to me about this era of gaming. This console managed to, without a doubt, set a precedent for the all-time low of how a console can get in the depths of being purely irrelevant. If before this video you haven't heard of the Atari 5200, it was because of one of two reasons. One, you're not in an environment where people talk about Atari consoles, which is probably most normal environments. And two, it's because there's not much to talk about. It didn't have an impact, didn't have a legacy. The only thing it taught us was what not to do, which was already pretty clearly defined at the time. And if there's that really small chance that you really love the Atari 5200 and would defend it to death, I would check on your significant other and your family. You know what, guys? I think we're done. We finished our midwinter cleaning, and it's spring now. I really enjoyed that. We got to see some of the worst failures in gaming, and it really serves as a message to up-and-coming games and consoles and programs on how to be successful. We even saw some really good things in there too. But more than anything, I'm just happy it's over with. Let's go ahead and see the end results. With all this new space, I decided to put my computer over here. It gives me a nice view of outside. Hi, Roll! It does come with one drawback though, is that there's no more room over there for me to record my videos. Luckily, I have a solution to that. Come on. Behold the new setup, a new place where we did not have sex in. There's a lot to this place. We got consoles, games, Mario, and of course we can't forget my favorite part. I love this guy. Well, thank you guys for joining me on my cleaning. I learned a lot about places I should not go to in my house. So until I inevitably have to do this again, see you next time. It's been 3 months.